been a while since we've been together. How was your summer? I hope you are responding in the positive. I honestly can't hear you, but I am aware of you because September is Attendance Awareness Month. See how I weave that in there? Again, I'll assume a positive response. Moving on, we have a positively positive person as our presenter today. It's Sara Gutterman, co-founder and CEO of Green Builder Media. She's here to explore successful ESG strategies, highlight standout companies, and share information about evolving investor requirements. Sara is going to provide COGNITION Smart Data market insights about consumer trends that have pulled ESG into the mainstream. And finally, she will discuss why ESG has become such a charged topic in the US and address critics' concerns about the potential for ESG to negatively impact financial performance. Now, in case you don't know Sara's background, she is a former venture capitalist. She graduated cum laude from Dartmouth College. She holds an MBA in entrepreneurship and finance from the University of Colorado. She has established a reputation as a visionary thought leader and passionate advocate for sustainability, and she works closely with a diverse group of stakeholders in the building industry to develop impactful, long-term green strategies that are simultaneously sustainable and profitable. Now, I need to take a moment to thank our sponsors for this webinar. First is Rheem Manufacturing. The brothers Richard and Donald Rheem founded Rheem Manufacturing Company in Emeryville, California in 1925. While the company has produced a number of products in its nearly 100 years of operation, Rheem is currently the only manufacturer in the world that produces heating, cooling, water heating, pool and spa heating, and commercial refrigeration products, and it is the largest manufacturer of water heating products in North America. Rheem Manufacturing is a global leader committed to delivering innovative products to save energy and support a more sustainable future. Our other sponsor is Trane Technologies. They are a global climate innovator, solving sustainability challenges through innovation in the heating and cooling industries. Through their strategic brands Trane and Thermo King, and their environmentally responsible portfolio of products and services, Trane Technologies brings efficient and sustainable climate solutions to buildings, homes, and transportation. Now, you can submit questions for Sara today. Simply use that questions box that's in the GoToWebinar control panel. I'm going to review those questions and pose those to her during the Q&A time set aside after her presentation. Sara, how was your summer?
My summer was fantastic, although way too short, Mike, but thank you for asking. I hope you had a great one too. Thank you so much. It's always such a pleasure to be here, Mike, with you and with our audience. A special thank you to you, Mike, for always being such a wonderful webinar moderator and coworker. And a shout out to our wizard behind the curtains, our production manager, Mary Kessner, who makes it all happen. So Mary, thank you. Another special thank you to Trane Technologies and to Rheem, not only for just being such wonderful ongoing partners and friends and colleagues, but also leaders in sustainability. We really appreciate the way that Trane Technologies and Rheem have both paved pathways for corporate and product sustainability. I'll actually talk about both of them a little bit later in the webinar. And thanks to everyone in attendance. I'm so pleased to be here to talk with you today about ESG, partly because ESG, or environmental, social, and governance, is one of my favorite topics to talk about. Most of my coworkers and friends and family are sick to death of me always bringing it up in any context. We're watching sports and I bring it up to my husband and he says, how is that connected? And I said, I don't know, but I just wanted to talk about it anyway. So that happens a lot. But I'm also incredibly excited about the momentum that ESG is gaining in the market. It's really become a moral imperative for businesses, offering clear, tangible benefits such as risk reduction, climate resiliency, employee and customer retention, brand enhancement, and financial gains. I'll talk more about those benefits in a little while. And, you know, let's recognize it has become a politically charged topic in the US and kind of is the center of some culture wars. I'll also address that I'll also talk about why ESG has become politicized and controversial, as well as some legitimate and perhaps not so legitimate criticism of ESG. But You know, I think some of my colleagues who have engaged in environmental, social, and governance strategies in their own corporations have expressed concern about the step back from ESG as a term. And really, time will tell if the ESG label will stick. But the premise behind the strategy isn't going away. And at the end of the day, ESG fundamentals are here to stay, mostly because investor requirements and consumer demand are overriding political posturing and pulling it into the mainstream. And so ultimately, whether it's called ESG or corporate sustainability or fried green tomatoes, what really matters is that the ESG fundamentals, which I'll talk about today, make good business sense. But if you take nothing else away from today's webinar, please hear this. ESG, by whatever name it is called, let's call it a rose, is not just a shrewd business strategy. It is also a reflection of this moment in time. And organizations that have a clear, thorough, authentic, and transparent ESG strategy really stand out like a beacon of light in a fractured and confusing world. And they offer hope to people amongst the fake news and the bedlam and what seems to be just daily chaos. And we as individuals, not business executives, not building professionals, not consumers or homeowners, but as individuals, we are searching for some semblance of sanity in what can sometimes feel like a world that's spinning out of control. And we want to feel safe and secure, and we want a pathway to hope and happiness, and not the, I don't really like this, but it will suffice for now version, but the I am all in wholeheartedly version. And I submit to you that ESG strategies are one vital spoke in a wheel of creating a world that feels safe and right and good. So I'm going to stop preaching for a minute until the end of the webinar, when you'll hear me come back to that. And let's just talk first about ESG origins. Where does it come from? So the term ESG originated from a United Nations report issued in 2004 titled "Who Cares Wins," which urged the financial industry to, quote, better integrate environmental, social, and governance issues in analysis, asset management, and securities brokerage. 1 year later, in 2005, the UN assembled a group of institutional investors, lenders, economists, and other stakeholders to create what's called the Principles for Responsible Investment, or PRI, which was a first of its kind signatory status that facilitated comparable measurement and validation for returns on investments that equally valued environmental, social, and financial criteria. And to become a PRI signatory, funds had to commit to incorporating ESG into investment analysis, decision-making processes, governance policies, and disclosures practices. So since 2005, the number of PRI signatories has ballooned to about 2,351 firms and represents about 2.5 trillion in capital. Now, let's talk about why ESG. And I think if you're here on this webinar today, you get the environmental reality and really the urgency of that environmental reality. So we know that climate change is unequivocally here and the worst is yet to come, and that we need a full-scale elimination of all greenhouse gas emissions to keep global warming under 2 degrees Celsius, ideally 1.5 degrees. If we surpass this threshold, we know that we will encounter irreversible impacts that will lead to widespread species extinction and ecosystem collapse, and that as the planet continues to warm, we can expect even more extreme temperatures, rising sea levels, intense superstorms, excessive flooding, severe drought, and raging wildfires. So I think that, that should be enough reason for companies and executives and even politicians to adopt ESG strategies. And really, the main point here that I want to make, that I really try to impress on people, is that if we do not immediately curb our fossil fuel addiction and cease destroying forest and ocean habitats, transform our industrial and agricultural practices, meaning if we stay on our current trajectory, we are expected to surpass that 2 degrees Celsius threshold within a shockingly short 5 years. Another major reason for ESG is our social reality. And there's something very interesting happening in the West, and particularly here in the US. Baby boomers who have worked for longer than generations previous to them are retiring in droves, and Xers, millennials, and Gen Zs are taking on leadership positions in business, in politics, in media, in not-for-profits, and they are bringing with them an ethic of sustainability that is very ingrained into their kind of generational psyche, particularly millennials and Gen Zs, who are deeply worried about the future and about climate change. You can see here on this chart that failure to mitigate and adapt to climate change is their #1 global risk of highest concern. And 77% of millennials and Gen Zs consider the future to be frightening. 56% think that humanity is doomed because of climate change. That's not 6%, that's not 16%, that is 56%. And what's really interesting to point out is that about 61% of millennials and Gen Zs, and it's actually higher among the Gen Z audience segment, report in surveys, in Green Builder Media cognition surveys, that they feel guilty about their negative impact on the environment, and 45% feel shame. And so there's this surge in a new field of medicine called ecopsychology, which actually measures the impact of nature and climate change on the human psyche. And we started watching ecopsychology and its growth as a field of medicine several years ago, and we've just seen it explode. And it's because this is a real thing, again, particularly among these younger generations. Now, high levels of climate anxiety and low levels of accountability and transparency has really led to historically low levels of consumer trust. And so while our survey respondents tell us, about 78% tell us that it is extremely important or very important for companies to have transparent and ethical business practices, 58% believe that companies greenwash very often, and almost, let's say 12.5% believe that companies almost always greenwash, right? They pretty much say, I don't believe anything that companies say anymore. Now, counterbalance that with the fact that over 90% of our survey respondents believe that companies should take a stand on environmental issues, and they prefer purchasing products from sustainable brands and companies that have strong ESG practices. I'll show you some more data that's pretty interesting a little bit later around these consumer trends. But, I think what's really important to note here is that the only way we get out of this historically low level of consumer trust is by providing more accountability, more transparency, more clarity, clearer claims, better evidence, more measurement. And all of those things are incorporated into ESG measurement tools and strategies. The third thing from the social reality standpoint is that we talk about climate change from a global perspective, but the impacts are acutely personal. And so we're starting to see people in all age groups, but again, particularly millennials and Gen Zs, being impacted by climate change, and they're worried that climate change is going to affect their water supply, their food supply, their energy supply, their personal safety and security. Millennials are, 3-4x more concerned about the resiliency, just resiliency in general, and the impact on their homes, because they are reporting that they are being impacted by hurricanes and tornadoes, extreme temperatures, wildfires, drought, flooding. And so therefore, that is continuing to drive that consumer demand for ESG. And of course, there is a just explosion in investor demand as well. So as you can see here, in 2022, investor assets in sustainable investments equaled about 8.4 trillion, or about 12.6 of all US assets under management. 444 mutual funds, 177 exchange traded funds offer investors a way to invest in ESG companies that have ESG strategies. And at this point, investors are really considering companies that have ESG strategies in place to be a better investment because they are better positioned to deal with the risks related to climate change and are therefore a safer place to put their money. We've seen that 81% of institutional investors in the US say that they plan to increase their allocations to ESG companies in the next 2 years. We're seeing that institutional-based investors and money management firms with sustainability strategies name climate change and carbon emissions as their top priority, with each group saying it applied more than 3 trillion of the assets that they control into ESG-related companies. And the list goes on and on. We have, Global Data's 2023 UK Life and Pension Survey that reveals that younger consumers are 50% more likely to put emphasis on sustainable investment principles and ESG companies, and that almost 70% of people under 40 see the principles of sustainable investment as important compared to older generations, which didn't quite emphasize sustainability and ESG as much historically in their investment decisions, even if they are doing more so now. Now, we know that ESG strategies help to minimize risk, enhance long-term performance, and improve resiliency against market volatility and idiosyncratic events like natural events. We also know, fortunately, that ESG is really becoming mission critical and an essential business requirement for investors, for lenders, for business executives themselves, and also for consumers. And, I think fortunately we are seeing that ESG is delivering tangible benefits like streamlined operations and productivity enhancements and supply chain strengthening beyond the risk reductions, which again is yielding positive results, financial results, and other kinds of results, relationship-based results, for example, to companies. And then on the market side, we are seeing new market-driven requirements for transparency and accountability to, again, address those historically low levels of trust. So our theory is that, ESG is really an unavoidable future to all of our benefit, because we really see that with some of the SEC requirements and other compliance-based issues, which I'll talk about in a moment, companies are soon going to be required to take more stringent action on climate and with respect to ESG. And again, I think that only ends up benefiting corporations, because ESG, we're seeing ESG strategies now lead to enhanced access to financing options, cost reductions, access to capital, again, increased productivity, decreased cycle time, increased use of circularity, as an example, a circular economy. And then again, as much as anything else, enhancing the relationships with stakeholders of all kinds, including investors, customers, and employees. Now, let's talk about ESG performance, because this is important. This is really where the center of the ESG debate has come in, because opponents have claimed that ESG harms financial performance by placing artificial constraints on decision-making, thereby creating obligations to prioritize unnecessary operational improvements and negatively impacting short-term results. And, we've seen some of those more vocal critics take some pretty strong action against ESG. So, for example, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed a bill in May barring the use of ESG when investing public money, and we're seeing that GOP-controlled states have pulled billions of dollars from firms like BlackRock, which, as we all know, was kind of an early proponent of ESG strategies. We also heard from the Utah State Treasurer Marlo Oaks that, according to Marlo, ESG is Satan's plan. So we've seen some pretty big culture wars. So I'm not going to necessarily get into the idiosyncratic and dogmatic part of ESG. What I will tell you about that, though, is all of the experts that I have spoken with, whether those are business executives at a very senior level of very large companies who are implementing strong ESG strategies, whether those are investors or bankers or even friends at BlackRock, they're all basically saying, look, that's kind of a flash in the pan, right? The criticism, the dogma, the culture wars, because what the real point here is that there is no empirical data that shows that there is a lack of performance from ESG companies. So let me cite a couple of examples. A recent study by PitchBook, which is a Morningstar company, provided comprehensive insight into the performance of ESG investment funds in areas of private equity, real estate, real assets, and private debt. And this study showed that ESG-related investment commitments rocketed from $16.1 billion in 2010 to about $20 billion in 2021. It actually dropped back a little bit in 2022 to $430 billion of the segment of investors that this study was examining. But that rollback in 2022 was due to tightening market conditions, not a systematic step back from ESG funds. But according to this report, there was no evidence that ESG funds differed in performance from their peers in any statistically valid way. And so a clear and consequential data point that works to debunk critics' claims regarding subpar returns was provided through that report. There are other reports by McKinsey or by Kroll, which is a financial analytics firm that recently studied 13,000 companies globally, and they showed that actually ESG performance was better. Those companies had about a 12.9% return versus an 8.6% return from laggards in ESG strategy globally. And those numbers actually went up in the US to about 20.3% returns versus a 13.9% return for the laggards. So clearly there is this growing body of evidence that shows that there are market rate or even better returns for ESG investments, meaning that whether, again, it's called ESG or corporate sustainability or whatever other label you want to give to it, these ESG commitments from lenders and venture capitalists, private equity, pension funds, stakeholders for companies are only going to increase. Now, there are some legitimate criticisms and concerns regarding the ESG measurement and ratings process. And there is a serious lack of standardization in both kind of what and how ESG factors should be measured and evaluated. And this is really true throughout all sectors, particularly the building industry, because some of the rating systems and the tools that have been created are for very large, very high impact sectors that use child labor and, extract blood diamonds. And so some of the rating systems that are not necessarily applicable to the building sector. So I will specifically address what's being done to provide a nuanced and focused ESG set of defining principles for the building industry. But I do think that the criticism that ESG has for in some cases being too vague or for not really having very targeted measurement and reporting requirements is a legitimate criticism. So with that, let me move on to ESG for building. So first, let me just say that there's never been more interest and capital available in the building industry for companies with ESG practices and those that incorporate ESG into their decision-making processes. We are absolutely seeing that ESG performance is influencing investment, loan, and insurance decisions. It's also influencing home buyer decisions, and I've got a bunch of data I'm going to show in a few minutes that corroborates that. And what I will say is for the companies that are interested in crafting or refining and enhancing their ESG strategies, it can be a little daunting, even for the most veteran of building professionals, because again, the ESG reporting frameworks are a bit amorphous and not necessarily industry specific for the building sector. And so that unconforming nature of ESG measurement and reporting can be a little, let's say, confusing or perhaps frustrating. And also the fact that, it's largely voluntary at this point. I do believe that that's going to change very quickly, not just with the SEC compliance requirements, but also through other regulatory requirements. So Green Builder Media, in response to the fact that there is no industry-specific guidance for the building sector for environmental, social, and governance, about probably a year and a half ago, we put a call out to the industry to pull together a group of subject matter experts to create a set of defining principles that are specific to the building industry. And so we put a call out. We thought we'd get maybe 20 to 30 people to join with us to create this set of defining principles. And we got about 100 people who raised their hands, and like some of the smartest people from around the industry: builders, developers, architects, folks from industry organizations like ResNet, investors, manufacturers, energy raters, other types of stakeholders. Folks from Rocky Mountain Institute, and we pulled together this group. We created, we decided to call it ESG for Building, and we broke up the group into a handful of subgroups. So business case, environmental, social, governance, compliance, measurement, innovation, and marketing and outreach. So I'm going to go through the first 7 of those areas and just talk very briefly. I'm not going to give a full dissertation just because we don't have time on each one of those sections, but just talk about some of those highlights. And then for those of you who are interested, go to greenbuildermedia.com, look for the ESG tab on the nav bar, and you can actually sign up to receive ongoing news about our ESG for Building group. It's a fully voluntary group, with the exception of our staff members who are organizing it, which we're paying for internally, and totally transparent. And this set of defining principles will be ready for public consumption, hopefully by the end of this year. So the first subgroup is business case. And I think I've already talked about a lot of these elements in terms of increased access to capital, reduced risk, enhanced brand reputation, enhanced relationships with stakeholders, talent retention, et cetera. But I think what's really important here is some of this data. This is COGNITION Smart Data, which is Green Builder Media's market intelligence and data division. Clearly, you can see here, when 60% of consumers tell us that they're more likely to do business with a company that has strong ESG practices, and 25% are very likely. And then, when we look at the fact, and this one's really interesting to me, that consumers are now associating ESG practices with the quality of a business's products. So it's not just about how a corporation operates and the emissions that said company emits, but now the perception is that ESG actually impacts the quality of products and services. So I think data like that is the business case itself for ESG practices. When we shift over to environmental, we can look at these topics on the left. Greenhouse gas emissions first, of course, starting with scope 1, 2, and 3. So emissions created internally, and then emissions created by sourcing energy, and then externally through supply chain partners. That's one of the kind of most top of mind topics in that E space. With respect to energy, of course, for buildings, that has to do with energy efficiency and renewables. In terms of land, this has to do with biodiversity and habitat protection, air, of course, indoor and outdoor air quality, things like fugitive emissions, which are maybe unintentionally released emissions from leaks or other unintentional carbon emissions. Water, of course, having to do with quality, quantity, and things like storm water runoff, climate resilient design, waste management. This really gets into that discussion about a circular economy, sustainable product design, so using products that have environmental product declarations or other certifications, and then innovation, and then working with supply chain partners to actually enhance their transparency and accountability and their ESG practices. And so we're starting to see more questions around this environmental related topics. So not just only what are the environmental impacts of a community, and is that community located in an ecologically sensitive area, but questions now like, how can builders and developers actually utilize natural features of a site, whether it's a single family home or a multifamily project or an entire community, to enhance climate resilient design and just resiliency in general. So one wonderful example that I like to point out is Babcock Ranch. When Hurricane Ida hit Central Florida not too long ago, Babcock Ranch, which is 100% solar powered community that actually utilizes natural swales and mangroves rather than just raising the land, cutting everything down and plopping the community down on it. It utilized those natural features. And it was one of the only communities in that flood zone from the hurricane that actually didn't flood, because nature did what it was meant to do, which is absorb those floodwaters. Next, we move to the social element. And I think that the most commonly discussed element of social is DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so this could span a range of looking at ethnicities and gender, and just in terms of inclusive hiring practices, certainly pay equity and living wage, looking at employee well-being and acquisition programs, career development programs, but then also looking outside of a company to community engagement. And I think once we start looking at the questions around the social element in the built environment, I'm hearing a lot of questions around not only what are amenities that a community can offer to enhance that social element, make the life better, improve the quality of life for occupants in that community or in that home, but how can the community provide a positive contribution to neighbors and surrounding communities? And I think that's a pretty exciting and interesting conversation that I'm hearing, because all of a sudden builders and developers and architects and designers and even energy raters are not functioning only within the context of a project, but kind of looking at that surrounding community. Moving on to governance, this is a lot of where we can again address those historically low levels of trust and look at enhanced accountability and transparency. So a lot of the governance practices have to do, for example, with board and executive compensation and oversight. So is ESG integrated into bonuses and compensation structures? Supplier codes of codes of conduct, environmental health and safety management, of course, code of ethics, not just within a company amongst employees, but within the board and the investor group and even the supply chain. And looking at risk management strategies to reduce risk, but also again enhance transparency, right? So what are the real climate risks for a company? So some of those questions again that we're participating in and hearing that we're excited about is there dedicated oversight of ESG issues, not just in a little department in a back room in a back office, but at an executive and a board level. How is ESG being incorporated into business strategies and decision making? Are leadership, executives, and employees following code of conducts? And how is ESG really not just assessed, but how is it impacting performance? When we move on to measurement, as we know, just with like green building certifications, there's a whole vast landscape of measurement tools and software programs and companies that are trying to address parts and pieces of ESG. So there are business measurements like B Corp. There are calculators that try to measure greenhouse gas emissions like BEAM and EC3. There are some of the stalwart energy rating software systems like ResCheck and Ecotrope. There are water programs, one actually that our moderator Mike helped to create, the WERS, water efficiency rating system. Resiliency, we see fortified homes a lot with respect to resiliency measurement. There's a whole, spectrum of health and wellness and indoor air quality rating systems. EPA's Indoor Air Plus is one of the most well-recognized ones. And then, of course, you've got your building certifications like the Department of Energy Zero Energy Ready Homes program and green building programs like the National Green Building Standard. And each one of these are kind of trying to take a little bite out of ESG. I can't say that there's any one tool or software program or platform that we've studied that provides everything to everyone. So in our defining principles document, we actually go through and provide insight into what the benefits are for each of these tools. I think we describe all of these on this slide and more in that. And so I think what we'll see is, just like we've seen with green building certifications and rating systems, that builders and developers and manufacturers are going to have to choose the certifications at this point that work best for them. Now, when we come to compliance, compliance is really important because as ESG has largely not been, there's not a set compliance structure that's in place at this point to follow that is mandatory. That is changing. And what we're seeing is that there are regulations that are putting into place, and this is going to impact all aspects of real estate development, building, manufacturing, and it's going to change the landscape. So, these new regulations in ESG reporting are going to affect everyone from large public companies to smaller private companies. And, it's really important for professionals to understand not just what these compliance and regulatory requirements are going to be, but how they can meet and exceed those compliance and regulatory requirements without negative impact on their companies. So, I think, for example, the SEC and Treasury rules are going to be relevant to the housing industry because large publicly traded companies will be under a clear obligation to report, for example, climate risk disclosure. We're also seeing that private development companies and builders and other smaller companies are impacted when they're going to seek capital And then home buyers are actually also going to be working with lenders and insurers that will be subject to reporting requirements and implementing climate-related considerations into their lending and underwriting processes. We're also seeing a little bit of this take place in the insurance sector right now, as we're seeing different insurance companies pull out of places like Florida and California because of superstorms and flooding and wildfires. And so while that isn't necessarily a direct compliance issue, we are going to see, again, changes in the marketplace that will impact major sectors related to the building industry. I'm not going to go into the specific SEC requirements or some of these other compliance issues just because of time. However, again, these will be included in our defining principles document available later this year. And then product innovation, I led this subgroup, so it's one of my favorites. We really looked at products, homes and buildings, and then communities and developments, and how to design up front with decarbonization, sequestration, circularity, life cycle in mind. We also go into great detail about alternative materials. It's really important right now, especially for concrete and steel. So two of the sectors that have the highest environmental and carbon emissions impact, that we either replace them with alternative materials or look for lower carbon solutions like carbon cures, concrete that integrates CO2. It actually integrates carbon into a cement mix to yield a more structurally sound concrete product that also ends up being a better carbon sink for carbon to absorb carbon in the long term. I also just wrote a blog on the decarbonization of the steel industry. Lots of pretty interesting things happening there, using scrap metal to recycle into new, greener steel, and then also using greener manufacturing processes that actually use electricity and renewable energy as opposed to massive amounts of coal and natural gas and other fossil fuel-based energy. So lots of innovation with respect to materials, same thing with respect to homes and buildings. So not only are we seeing huge advancements in net zero, all electric, healthy, connected, solar plus storage power homes, but of course off-site construction and prefab, which I really believe does help solve for many issues that are plaguing the housing market, labor, material shortages, high material prices. Off-site and prefab doesn't come, it's not, the leprechaun and unicorn that's going to cure all of our ills. It does have challenges as well, but I think that we're seeing huge advancements in those areas. And then same thing on a community and development scale, we're seeing changes in terms of the way that we're looking at land use. More mixed use development, and whereas we can be a little more flexible with zoning. Certainly we're playing with density and looking at diversifying housing options to accommodate multiple income types. And I think the thing that's really exciting from an ESG perspective for me with respect to communities and developments is that we again are starting to participate in and talk with builders and developers and architects and related professionals that are looking at, again, not just the energy efficiency or renewable energy of a home or a community, but how we can create housing to become a panacea for health and wellness, and to actually create generational wealth for home buyers, not just for the first home buyer, but the second, third, or fourth buyer and owner. In terms of ESG trends, we're seeing that the most commonly used ESG frameworks include things like Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, or SASB, GRI, which is a global reporting initiative, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and the UN Global Compact. In terms of data transparency, the companies that we deem kind of exceptional with respect to ESG do have their data third-party validated rather than just having an internal audit. We are seeing that ESG reports are largely organized around a company's material risks. And generally, those start with the E, then the S, and then the G in the building industry. In other sectors, we actually see that the S comes first because that is more material to other industries. But in the building industry, because the built environment is so conspicuously consumptive, it's really the E that comes first, both for manufacturers as well as the few builders and developers that are at this point releasing ESG reports or at least information. It is very important that all companies go through this materiality assessment to understand which areas are most important to their companies and to create goals and strategies accordingly. Now, a couple of eco leaders, and these two happen to be our sponsors, but I think it's really important that the reason why Train Technologies and Ream are our sponsors today is because they are eco leaders, and we've been working with them for a long time and have just been impressed for years and years. Train Technologies, again, for at least a decade, probably more, has been a leader with respect to corporate sustainability. They've released a Gigaton Challenge, which is a pledge to reduce about 1 billion metrics of carbon emissions by 2030, with a goal of becoming carbon neutral across all aspects of their operations. They're really focusing on water and waste reductions and other social related things like gender parity advancements. And again, they're looking to decarbonize not just their company, but their entire value chain by 2050. And I think something really important about Train is that Train Technologies is the first in its industry and one of the first companies in the world to have its net zero carbon emissions targets approved by the Science Based Target Initiative, or SBTI. And Ream is also, considered by our team as an eco leader, really not just for their efforts on a corporate level, but on a product level. So they were the first to market with an energy certified heat pump water heater, which we know is critical for the advancement of the climate movement, from switching from gas to electricity or an all-electric home. They have done some wonderful things with respect to packaging and recyclability. They also have focused a lot of dollars and human resource into kind of streamlining the process for their stakeholders as well as their customers, plumbers and contractors and other key stakeholders, to understand how to specify and install their sustainable products. So kudos to both Train and Ream for their efforts in sustainability. Now, I'm going to take a few minutes just to go through some of our data. Green Builder Media's COGNITION Smart Data just conducted a survey of our leading edge audience. So keep in mind, when I show you the data over the next few minutes, we reach a group of millions of early adopter and first mover consumers, as well as building professionals. So keep in mind, this is the leading edge of the market. And when we survey our audience, it's kind of like having a crystal ball, so to speak, because where our audience is today is where the mainstream is heading in the next 6, 12, 24 months. So our leading edge audience has a fairly high level of ESG, high level of familiarity with ESG investments. You can see that, over 65% are either extremely familiar or very familiar, and about 70% have ESG related investments in their portfolio. When we ask which factors influence their decision to invest in ESG companies, the first is enhancing environmental protection. The second is enhanced financial returns. And the third is more responsible governance. So again, addressing those low levels of trust and accountability and transparency. I mentioned this earlier, but I wanted to point it out again. Our consumer audience, 50% say that ESG practices impact the quality of products and services, and then a great deal, and then 25% say somewhat. So there is that link in consumers' minds. You can see here that 85% of our leading edge audience are either very likely or somewhat likely to do business with a company that has a strong ESG focus compared to one that does not. And our audience, about 58% believe that companies with an ESG focus are more likely to have long-term financial success than those without. You can see that about 75% of our audience say that they have stopped purchasing products from a company because of concerns over their sustainability practices, and a very high level, so let's say 72%, 75% believe that it's important to that a company's marketing and advertising messages align with their ESG practices. Again, very important to have that authenticity and transparency. So not, greenwashing. So when we ask about homes and buildings, again, here you can see that, over 75% say of our consumer audience say that they're more likely to choose a building or a residence with strong ESG practices from a builder or a developer, or a home that has energy efficiency, renewable energy, health and wellness systems in place, et cetera. And then when we ask how much our survey respondents believe that buildings with strong ESG practices can have a positive impact on health and well-being, again, here you can see that nearly 50%, let's say 48%, believe that there's a great deal of impact of buildings with a strong ESG practice that impacts health and wellness. So again, just like our consumer audience makes a link between quality of products and ESG practices at a corporate level, they also link health and wellness with ESG practices. And this is a question that we asked and we broke down by generation. And so you can see that the younger the generation is, the more ESG factors into decision-making the decision-making process when making decisions about purchasing products. Now, our consumer audience is not only investing in and buying products from ESG companies, they are, kind of taking action to decarbonize their own lifestyle by driving electric vehicles, increasing the energy efficiency of their home, reducing waste, turning their homes all electric, eating organic food, buying sustainable products. They think that the best way to decarbonize is adopting renewable energy, electrifying transportation and buildings, and then reducing emissions from industry and manufacturing. And they believe that decarbonization strategies for companies result in enhanced innovation, generate positive brand equity, and yield greater financial returns, and also mitigate risk. Now, when we shift over to our builder insights and we ask our builder audience, and again, these are leading edge, early adopter, first mover builders, what the main driver is for adopting ESG into their businesses. The first is increased access to capital. The second response is meeting consumer demand. And then the third is meeting investor demand. So very kind of, finance and sales based. We have also seen that about 55% of our builder survey respondents tell us that they have seen an increase in ESG requirements when applying for financing. And they let's say nearly 45% believe that adopting an ESG strategy is important to the long-term success of their company, and almost 30% believe that adopting ESG practices for the long-term success of their company is extremely important. And about 65% have seen an increase in demand for ESG compliant buildings in just the past year. So that's a pretty big demand increase. Now, when we ask our builder survey what types of ESG investments in the building sector they think will have the greatest growth potential in the next 5 years, it's first water, energy efficient HVAC systems and sustainable materials in general, and then demand side energy management systems. When we ask what the main drivers are for their company for building a sustainable supply chain, so this is important for the manufacturers, it's access to accurate and reliable data for disclosures and to prevent greenwashing claims. Those are two of the top responses. Develop innovative products and solutions, and then also respond to external pressure from investors and consumers. So you can see that our builder audience is telling us that they need enhanced accountability and sustainability from their suppliers, the vendors and other partners in order to enhance their own transparency and accountability. It seems that for our builders, environmental, social, and governance, they're not too far. This is a ranked and weighted average. So it's not too much of a dramatic difference between the E and the S and the G in terms of what they prioritize and measure within their company. And, interestingly, and this was a surprise to me, let's say about 70% of our audience 60% believes that they are prepared for increased regulatory oversight, either because they already exceed current requirements and quickly can transition to new requirements, or they're in the process of becoming prepared and developing an ESG strategy that can withstand that shift in regulations and oversight. So that's the data I wanted to present. So let me just summarize with the fact that there is much ground to cover in terms of determining ESG guidelines with respect to shifting compliance and regulatory landscape, in terms of implementation and measurement and reporting and accountability. But certainly one thing is sure, that the direction of travel is clear. And if you're not already considering ESG for your organization, frankly, the train is leaving the station, and sorry to be so cliche, but you really want to hop on it. And again, hopefully I have demonstrated the tangible risks and the investor demand. But as much as anything else, because we are in the building industry, I just want to, go back to the fact that today's homeowners aren't just looking for net zero, electric, healthy, resilient, connected homes. What they really want is a sense of security, safety, and stability in troubled times, purpose and meaning in a confusing world, and authentic leadership that really stands out like a beacon of truth. And, I think that ESG is certainly one way to provide that level of orientation and optimism that consumers, especially those younger generations, are looking for. Because I think they're looking to do business and buy products from companies that make their lives safer and help themselves become more sustainable. And I think that we should all be prepared for these younger generations to continue asking big questions that are tough and to the point. And so we need to prepare our strategies and have not just the commitments in place, but the validation and the accountability and the measurement. And I think that if you can provide that, that's how companies, whether you are a building professional or a manufacturer or some other related type of professional, can really create enduring bonds. Because today, relationships that matter have never been more vital, nor have they been harder to craft. And, we see this increase in the desire to believe in better from these younger generations, where they want purpose and truth and meaning more than they want a lot of stuff or a really big house with a lot of square feet. They're much more discerning about what they buy, and these younger generations actually eschew climbing the consumerist ladder that says that what you have and what brands that you wear determine your identity. So, again, I think that ESG is a really clear and important pathway to get to where we need to be from an environmental standpoint, but also to repair some of our social issues through clear governance, through clear measurement and transparency. And so I'm going to wrap up there. We've got about, let's say, 7 minutes for questions. So Mike, I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you everyone for listening. Feel free to email me if you have any questions that we're not able to address today. And please go to our website at greenbuildermedia.com and click on the ESG tab. You can sign up for our ESG for Building RSS feed, which will get you delivered into your inbox articles and blogs about ESG and related topics. And then ultimately, it will get you access to our set of defining principles, which goes into much more depth into all of these things. Finally, I will just make a shameless plug for the fact that Green Builder Media does offer ESG consulting services. And if there's a nuanced area that we can't address ourselves because it requires specific subject matter expertise, we do work with a wide spectrum of other subject matters and outside experts. Subject matter experts and outside organizations, there we go, that complement our expertise. So again, thank you. And Mike, take it away for about 7 minutes.
All right, thank you, Sara. And I started out describing you as a positively positive person, but you're also a positively passionate person. So thank you for all that you presented here. And yes, please send in your questions for Sara now. We do have one already from Sean, who wanted to know, what is the process for Green Builder Media to research product innovation?
So that is a good question. And let me give a two-layered answer. The first layer is, since our inception 18 years ago, we have always endeavored to be on the leading edge of sustainability. And so we've been doing this for a while, and our team really understands innovation with respect to the built environment. So we are constantly looking at products and systems and technologies that raise the bar on sustainability. So it's something that's just inherent in our DNA, and we've been doing for a long, long time. So we do that on literally a daily basis for our editorial creation throughout all of our media channels. Specifically, with respect to the ESG for Building initiative, we had a subgroup that was comprised of a really great group of, again, builders, developers, subject matter experts, designers, et cetera, that also have been on the leading edge of sustainability for decades in their own careers. And so, and then we have a dedicated staff member that is focused on helping to provide research for this set of defining principles. So we gave her direction just based on our own subject matter expertise. And collectively through our group, we went out and kind of divided and conquered and researched different categories and different types of products. Now, with that said, our search was not exhaustive, and we certainly don't know what we don't know. And so if you have any ideas for innovative products that you'd like to submit to us, either for editorial coverage through Green Builder Media or inclusion in our Defining Principles doc, please shoot me an email. I'd love to see what you have to say. One thing I do want to say about product innovation is I was providing a webinar to a group of people from the national laboratories and the Department of Energy and other related organizations. And there was someone on that call that happens to be in the mycelia space, so mushroom-based insulation and other related products, which is an exciting sector. But he kind of got on me for talking about cross-laminated timber and bamboo as viable alternatives because bamboo is quickly growing and cross-laminated timber is an efficient use of timber. And he said, how could you, promote wood, it's a natural resource, blah, 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 whatever. He had his arguments. And so just so you know, right now we are taking an all hands on deck. We need every single thing we can to replace conventional non-sustainable products. We're not advocating for one category over another. We're really saying, look, here is the whole spectrum of what's available and what needs to be considered. So we're looking more at the consideration process and decision-making process necessarily than any one particular product that we're calling out or even one particular category, because I really do believe that it's more important right now to kind of have a whole menu of products and systems and technologies that we can pick from that are appropriate for a wide spectrum of products, because there's no silver bullet product. If there was, everybody would be using it. So.
All right, thank you, Sara. And I've got a question for you as well, but also wanted to put out a final call for questions from our audience. So you brought up greenwashing earlier, and I guess I'm still kind of wondering, how do companies walk the line between marketing their accomplishments while avoiding doubts or concerns about greenwashing. And here's what I mean, Sarah. Most people aren't going to read an ESG report. Not unlike most people don't read a company's 10K or their quarterly SEC filings, right? So if they tout their own ESG report in marketing, what do they need to do to convince their targeted audience that it's legit?
It's a great question, Mike. And, the real truth is I'm not sure that I have like the complete answer. Like, I don't think there is any, panacea or silver bullet to say, that differentiates between like, here is your totally ungreenwashed solution versus one that has some ambiguity. What I will say is that the companies that we work with that do have that third-party validation and the certification and can point to at least attempts to really try to validate, kind of accurately measure and validate their data are the ones that don't get accused of greenwashing either ever or as often, let's say. The ones that make claims based on a good marketing spin, I think, are the ones that are more at risk of being accused of greenwashing. And, I think it can be pretty, pretty clear, pretty, black and white in terms of, if you have set certain goals and you have achieved those goals, then talk about that. If you haven't achieved those goals, that's actually okay too, as long as you talk about it, right? As long as you talk about challenges and, why you didn't reach something or struggles that you encountered and why you had to pivot. In fact, we have a group that I know you're familiar with. It's called our Next Generation Influencer Group. It's comprised of millennial and Gen Z's influencers, just cool people doing cool things in sustainability. And we had just had a recent discussion with them, and they said exactly that. They said, look, I don't need a company to be perfect. I just need them to be honest in order for me to trust them. So, and I think about like, there was that whole Volkswagen scandal, it was, years ago about the emissions from their vehicles, and Volkswagen had previously had such an impeccable reputation. And then all of a sudden, it was unveiled that they were actually lying and, cheating on emissions tests. And all of a sudden, this group of buyers, not necessarily younger buyers for that particular case, but they just decided that they were going to walk away from Volkswagen because they felt lied to, right? And it was a thing where they were like, look, Volkswagen doesn't have to have a zero emissions vehicle right now. They just need to tell the truth about what they are emitting. So, I think that the truth is you just need to tell the truth. And be as transparent as possible, and then as much as possible measure and validate, and get that third-party validation for your claims. The other thing that's interesting, there's greenwashing, but now there's something that's called green hushing, right? So it's these companies that were once very vocal about their ESG and corporate sustainability strategies, that because of the politicization of ESG, they're walking back against talking about them, even if they are still implementing them. So green hushing is a thing, which honestly is, it makes me sad to see, because I feel like the way that ESG wins is that we just get rid of the drama, right? And just make it common sense and show the economic returns and the material benefits to companies, right? And just say, look, this isn't political, it's not emotional, it's not sentimental, it's just common sense. And frankly, that's what we did with green building. I mean, you've been with us for decades, in this journey. And, the reason why green building and sustainability has been pulled through in the built environment is because it's cost effective now and it makes sense, and consumers want it and investors are demanding it. So same thing with ESG.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the third party validation is where it is going to get its foothold, and then from there you build that reputation, because a lot of this is, I don't want to say new, but the ESG component, the reporting component is relatively new. that obligation that I think I agree with you. I think that it'll get a foothold there. They'll get their integrity and reputation going, and it'll just carry on through the day. So, well, Sara, thank you so much for going through this. And the Cognition Smart Data is always cool to look at. So we really do appreciate it. And we got a lot of positive comments from people, some of our friends and family saying hi, but also people we don't know quite yet have also said thank you for all this wonderful information. And for those of you who are watching live and you're wondering, hey, I want to check this out again, you'll be able to see the recording. You'll get a link to that a little bit later in the week. I wanted to make sure to not just thank our audience, but also thank our sponsors, Train Technologies and Ream Manufacturing. Thank you both for your generous sponsorship of this webinar. And I wanted to make a quick plug for our upcoming Housing 2.0 Thought Leader webinar. It's happening 1 week from today. It's going to be September 20th, if you're watching the recording. We will be joined by sustainability superhero Peter Pfeiffer, and he will discuss climate change responsive design. And we'll start at our usual time of 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Until next week, stay safe, stay healthy, and take care, everyone. So long.